June 6, 1944, off the coast of Normandy, France. The English Channel churns black under a gray dawn sky. How a U.S. general transformed a looming defeat into triumph on D-Day, but not in the way you think. General Omar Bradley stood aboard the USS Augusta, watching his invasion crumble before his eyes. Machine guns raked American boys as they stumbled from landing craft into bloody surf. Radio reports screamed disaster. Omaha may be lost. His staff begged him to order evacuation. 5,000 ships waited offshore, yet Nazi bunkers held firm against wave after wave of America's finest. But Bradley had one desperate card left to play, a decision so dangerous it could sink his own destroyers. What he did next violated every rule of naval warfare. His choice would either save D-Day or turn triumph into catastrophe. How do you transform certain defeat into unstoppable victory? The answer lies in one general's impossible gamble. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The English Channel stretched black and endless under storm clouds that June morning, its surface broken by the largest armada in human history. 5,000 Allied ships rode at anchor, their engines humming low against the darkness. Aboard transports and landing craft, 156,000 men waited in silence, some praying, others checking equipment for the 100th time. The invasion fleet represented 3 years of planning, the combined industrial might of free nations, and the hopes of enslaved Europe. But before dawn broke, the carefully orchestrated plan began unraveling overhead. 13,000 aircraft droned through thick clouds toward the Norman coast. Inside the cramped fuselages of C-47 transport planes, paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne sat wedged knee to knee, their faces painted black, weapons strapped tight. The Pathfinder aircraft, carrying navigation teams meant to mark drop zones with lights and radio beacons, fought crosswinds and German flak. Many never reached their targets. Lieutenant John Spaulding of the 29th Infantry Division stood at the rail of his transport ship, watching red tracers arc up from the French coast. Radio chatter filled the night air with confusion. Drop zones missed by miles. Gliders crashed in flooded fields. Airborne units scattered across 50 square miles of enemy territory. Their careful organization dissolved into chaos. In the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley leaned over maps marked with red pins and grease pencil lines. Each pin represented a unit, each line an objective. As reports crackled in from the airborne forces, orderlies moved pins across the map like pieces in a deadly game. Too many pins clustered in wrong positions. Too many units reported missing or destroyed. Bradley's weathered face showed no emotion as he absorbed each report, but his staff officers exchanged worried glances. The invasion's first phase, establishing inland strongpoints to prevent German counterattacks, was failing before the main assault began. If the airborne forces couldn't hold their positions, the seaborne invasion would face disaster. The general checked his watch, 0400 hours. In 90 minutes, the first landing craft would hit the beaches. There was no turning back now. Dawn brought no relief, only revelation of how completely the invasion plan had collapsed. The ramp of landing craft vehicle personnel 1443 dropped with a metallic clang into 3 feet of churning surf. Sergeant First Class Spaulding stepped forward, rifle held high, and immediately understood that everything had gone wrong. The beach ahead wasn't the gentle slope shown in reconnaissance photos. German artillery had been repositioned. The naval bombardment had missed its targets. Machine gun fire from MG-42s raked the waterline before the men could take 10 steps. The distinctive sound, like ripping canvas magnified 1,000 times, cut through the crash of waves and shouting of officers. Spaulding watched soldiers from the first wave drop into the surf, their equipment dragging them under the dark water. The Atlantic Wall revealed its true face here at Omaha Beach. 15-foot steel stakes jutted from the sand at odd angles, designed to tear open landing craft. Mines buried in the shingle exploded under the weight of running men. Wire obstacles created killing zones where soldiers bunched together. perfect targets for German gunners in concrete bunkers built into the cliffs. Spaulding crawled forward on his belly, salt water and sand filling his mouth. Around him, the beach became a charnel house. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men called for medics who couldn't reach them through the crossfire. Equipment lay scattered across the sand. Rifles, radios, ammunition, all the tools of war rendered useless by German precision. The 29th Division had trained for this moment for 2 years. They had studied maps, practiced landings, learned to fight as a team. But no training could prepare them for the reality of MG-42s firing 100 rounds per minute from positions the Navy had failed to destroy. Within the first hour, over 300 men lay dead or wounded on a stretch of sand barely 500 yards wide. Radio reports reaching the command ships offshore painted the same picture of disaster. The 1st Infantry Division, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, pinned down at Easy Red Sector. The 116th Infantry Regiment cut to pieces at Dog Green. Engineers trying to clear obstacles shot down before they could reach the steel barriers. As the tide rose, threatening to drown wounded soldiers clinging to the shallows, one terrible truth became clear: Omaha Beach was failing. In the cramped command center aboard the USS Augusta, cigarette smoke hung thick as the ventilation system struggled against the humidity of dozens of sweating officers. Map tables covered with acetate overlays showed the invasion beaches in precise detail, but the red grease pencil marks told a story of catastrophe unfolding. General Omar Bradley stood motionless as his communication staff fed him reports from the beach. Each message brought worse news: heavy casualties at Dog Green, no advance beyond seawall, request immediate reinforcement. The steady tick of the ship's chronometer marked time slipping away, each second bringing the invasion closer to total failure. Bradley's aide, Colonel Chester Hansen, approached with the morning's most devastating message. Intelligence intercepts suggested German reinforcements were already moving toward the coast. If the Americans couldn't break through the beach defenses within hours, Rommel's panzer divisions would arrive to crush the beachhead. The general's staff offered their professional advice: evacuate Omaha Beach, redirect follow-up waves to Utah and Gold Beaches, where British and Canadian forces had gained footholds. Cut losses before they became catastrophic. It was sound military thinking, the kind taught at West Point and practiced in war games. But Bradley understood what his staff did not. There was no fallback plan. Operation Overlord had been designed as an all-or-nothing gamble. 5,000 ships crowded the channel, visible to German reconnaissance aircraft. The largest secret in military history had been exposed. If D-Day failed, there would be no second chance. Hitler would rush every available division to strengthen the Atlantic Wall. The war might drag on for years. The general studied the map one more time, his finger tracing the blue line representing the English Channel. Just offshore from Omaha Beach, pencil marks indicated the positions of Navy destroyers: USS Satterley, USS Carmack, USS Frankfurt. Small ships by battleship standards, but each carried 5-inch guns capable of devastating firepower. Naval doctrine dictated that destroyers stay well offshore, beyond range of coastal artillery. Moving close to shore violated every principle of fleet protection, but doctrine had also said the preliminary bombardment would silence German guns, and doctrine had been proven wrong by the corpses littering Omaha Beach. Bradley reached for the ship's telegraph, his hand steady despite the magnitude of his decision. He was about to order destroyers into point-blank range of enemy guns, risking their destruction to save an invasion that might already be lost. The USS Satterley cut her engines and drifted toward shore under power of momentum alone, her bow pointed directly at the German gun positions carved into the Norman cliffs. Commander William Sanders watched the depth finder numbers drop steadily: 40 feet, 35, 30. At 20 feet, his ship would run aground and become a sitting target for every German gun on the coast. But the sight through his binoculars demanded the risk. American soldiers lay pinned against Omaha's seawall, unable to advance or retreat. The preliminary bombardment had failed because Navy gunners, firing from 10 miles offshore, couldn't see their targets through smoke and haze. The Germans had built their bunkers into reverse slopes, invisible to ships at long range but perfectly positioned to slaughter infantry. Sanders's gun crews loaded high explosive shells into the 5-inch mounts, their movements sharp with practiced efficiency. At 1,000 yards from shore, dangerously close for a warship, the destroyer's guns could fire with the precision of artillery pieces. The gunners could see their targets: concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, observation posts built into the cliff face. The first salvo erupted from Satterlee's forward guns with a sound like thunder compressed into a single moment. 5-inch shells screamed across the narrow gap of water and exploded against German fortifications with devastating effect. Concrete fragments showered down the cliff face. Steel reinforcement bars twisted into abstract sculptures of destruction. On the beach, Sergeant Spaulding felt the concussion waves wash over him as naval shells passed overhead. The German machine gun that had pinned his squad for 2 hours went silent, its position obliterated by a direct hit. For the first time since landing, he could raise his head without drawing immediate fire. USS Carmick joined the bombardment. Then USS Frankfurt, each ship anchoring close enough to shore that German artillery could return fire. The risk was enormous. One lucky shot could cripple a destroyer, trapping it within range of shore batteries. But the gamble was working. German strongpoints that had withstood hours of infantry assault crumbled under direct naval gunfire. Through the smoke and flame, American soldiers began to move again. Engineers crawled forward to blast gaps and wire obstacles. Medics reached wounded men trapped in the surf. Squad leaders rallied survivors for another attempt to reach the bluffs overlooking the beach. The destroyers had given them something more valuable than covering fire. They had given them hope. 200 miles away in Germany, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat at his wife's breakfast table, reading intelligence reports that should have sent him racing back to France. Allied shipping concentrations in English ports, increased radio traffic from British headquarters, weather reports showing a brief break in the June storm pattern. Every sign pointed to imminent invasion. But this was June 6th, his wife Lucy's birthday, and the Desert Fox had promised to be home for the celebration. Besides, his meteorologists assured him that channel storms would prevent any major operation for at least a week. The Allies needed perfect weather for their amphibious assault. They would wait. In Normandy, German officers commanding the Atlantic Wall faced the growing invasion without their most competent commander. Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann, responsible for the 7th Army's coastal defenses, possessed neither Rommel's tactical genius nor authority to deploy strategic reserves. Hitler had kept the panzer divisions under personal control, refusing to delegate authority even to his most trusted generals. The German 352nd Infantry Division, holding the Omaha sector, consisted largely of Eastern Front veterans who understood warfare's brutal mathematics. They could see Allied ships stretching to the horizon, more vessels than Germany's entire navy. They could count enemy aircraft darkening the sky, outnumbering the Luftwaffe by 40 to 1. Professional soldiers recognize hopeless odds when they see them. Major Werner Pluskat, commanding artillery positions overlooking Omaha Beach, radioed his superior with a situation report that bordered on desperation. The sea is black with ships. I count at least 10,000 vessels. Request immediate reinforcement. The response came back with Prussian efficiency. No reserves available. Hold your positions. German ammunition stores, carefully rationed throughout 1944, dwindled rapidly under the intensity of the bombardment. Each artillery piece was limited to 50 rounds per day, barely enough for a single sustained barrage. Meanwhile, American destroyers fired hundreds of shells in minutes, their supply lines stretching back to the vast industrial capacity of the United States. The contrast was starker than numbers could convey. German soldiers, among the finest infantry in the world, found themselves fighting not just American troops, but American production. The factories of Detroit, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Liberty ship fame. They faced an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. As reports of the destroyer bombardment reached German headquarters, the bitter truth became clear. No amount of tactical skill could overcome such material disadvantage. Marie Dubois pressed her face against the cellar window of her farmhouse near Colville-sur-Mer, watching her world transform before her eyes. The apple orchard where her children had played yesterday was now a moonscape of shell craters and splintered trees. The stone walls her grandfather had built lay scattered across fields churned to mud by tank treads and artillery fire. The thunder had started before dawn, not the clean crash of summer storms, but the sustained rumble of naval bombardment that made the earth shake and dust fall from ceiling beams. Through the small window, she could see soldiers in olive-green uniforms moving through the ruins of her village, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion. When the first American appeared at her door, Marie expected the worst. German propaganda had painted vivid pictures of Allied brutality, promising that invasion would bring rape, murder, and pillage. Instead, the young soldier offered her family chocolate bars and cigarettes, his broken French carrying an accent she had never heard before. The abundance was incomprehensible. These soldiers carried more food in their individual rations than Marie's family had seen in weeks. Their uniforms were new, their equipment clean and functional. They distributed chewing gum to children and canned meat to families who had survived on turnips and ersatz coffee for 4 years of occupation. Behind them came machines that defied European understanding of warfare. Bulldozers that could carve roads through forests in hours. Trucks carrying loads that would have required dozens of horse-drawn wagons. Jeeps that seemed to run endlessly without concern for fuel conservation. The scale of material abundance spoke to a nation that had never known rationing, never faced the choice between feeding soldiers and feeding civilians. By nightfall, 156,000 Allied troops had landed across 5 beaches. Within a week, the number would double. American supply ships arrived daily, unloading mountains of equipment onto beaches that had been killing fields that morning. Engineers laid steel matting to create instant airstrips. Signal Corps teams strung telephone lines across the countryside, connecting scattered units into a unified command structure. Young Pierre Dubois, Marie's 10-year-old son, unwrapped his first Hershey bar with the reverence of a religious ceremony. The sweetness was unlike anything in his memory of wartime France. Through the farmhouse window, artillery continued to thunder in the distance, but it was moving away now, inland toward German positions. Liberation had come with a taste of chocolate and the promise of abundance beyond imagining. By mid-afternoon, Sergeant Spaulding had crawled, stumbled, and fought his way to the base of the cliffs overlooking Omaha Beach. Behind him, the sand was littered with the debris of battle, destroyed landing craft, abandoned equipment, and the still forms of soldiers who would never see home again. But ahead of him, barely visible through smoke and cordite haze, lay the first German bunker complex. The naval bombardment had done its work with devastating efficiency. Concrete walls 3 feet thick bore crater-sized gaps where 5-inch shells had found their mark. Steel reinforcement bars jutted from shattered casements like broken bones. The MG-42 position that had commanded the entire beach approach lay silent, its crew buried under tons of rubble. Engineers worked frantically to clear paths through wire obstacles and minefields, their Bangalore torpedoes exploding in sequence up the cliff face. Medics moved among the wounded with morphine and pressure bandages, performing triage under fire. Radio operators finally re-established contact with ships offshore, calling for artillery support against remaining German positions. The breakthrough came not as a dramatic charge, but as the gradual accumulation of small victories. One squad clearing a communication trench, another destroying a mortar position, flamethrower teams burning out snipers' nests. The kind of dirty, dangerous work that never made newspaper headlines but won battles yard by yard. By evening, American flags flew from German bunkers, and the first jeeps rolled up newly constructed roads toward the village of Colville. The beach that had been a killing ground at dawn had become a highway for liberation. Landing craft arrived hourly with reinforcements, supplies, and the heavy equipment necessary to sustain offensive operations inland. General Bradley received the message he had waited for since H hour. Omaha secured. Casualties heavy but acceptable. Request follow-up forces. The relief in his voice was audible to everyone in the Augusta's command center. The gamble had paid off. The destroyer's point-blank bombardment had broken the Atlantic Wall's strongest position. But the numbers told the true story of victory. Over 2,400 American casualties at Omaha Beach, a devastating toll by any measure. Yet even this bloodiest of the D-Day landings had cost fewer men than single battles on the Eastern Front consumed daily. American industrial capacity could replace losses. German could not. The mathematics of attrition favored abundance over scarcity, production over conservation. The beachhead was secure, but more importantly, the precedent was established. American firepower, properly applied, could overcome any defensive position. The Liberty ship, SS Roberto, Rowan rode low in the water as stevedores worked through the night, unloading her cargo onto the expanding complex of docks and supply dumps growing along the Norman coast. Each ship carried 10,000 tons of supplies, ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical equipment, everything an advancing army needed to sustain operations far from home. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Behind the Liberty ships came the LSTs, landing ship tanks, their flat bottoms designed to drive directly onto beaches and discharge cargo. Sherman tanks rolled down steel ramps onto French soil, their diesel engines adding to the industrial symphony of liberation. Each tank represented months of factory work, tons of steel, rubber, and precision engineering that German industry could no longer match. The statistics were staggering in their implications. American shipyards had produced Liberty ships at a rate of 3 per day during peak production. Henry Kaiser's Richmond yards had built one ship in 4 days and 15 hours, a record that demonstrated the productive capacity of democratic capitalism unleashed for war. By contrast, Germany's entire merchant marine had been reduced to coastal traffic, starved of fuel and raw materials. General Bradley walked among the supply dumps, observing the material manifestation of American power. Pyramids of artillery shells stretched toward the horizon. Gasoline in 5-gallon jerry cans, millions of gallons pumped through underwater pipelines from England. Rations enough to feed a city, medicine to treat every conceivable battlefield injury, communications equipment to coordinate operations across hundreds of miles. Each rifleman in the invasion carried more individual firepower than entire Civil War regiments. His M1 Garand rifle, manufactured by Springfield Armory at a rate of 6,000 per day, gave him 8-shot semi-automatic capability unknown to armies of previous generations. His steel helmet, webbing, and individual first aid packet represented industrial design applied to soldier survival. The contrast with German equipment was telling. Wehrmacht soldiers still relied on bolt-action rifles and horse-drawn transport. Their wonder weapons, V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets, consumed enormous resources while producing minimal military effect. They were symptoms of desperation, not signs of technological superiority. As bulldozers carved new roads through Norman farmland and engineers assembled prefabricated bridges over streams and rivers, the scope of American logistical planning became apparent. Every bolt, every gallon of fuel, every medical bandage had been calculated, manufactured, and shipped according to precise schedules developed months in advance. The arsenal of democracy had delivered its promise. Overwhelming material superiority translated into unstoppable military momentum. Colonel Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division received orders to counterattack the Allied beachhead at 1400 hours, nearly 8 hours after the first landings. By then, the tactical window for defeating an amphibious assault had already closed. German doctrine called for immediate response to invasion within the first hour, while enemy forces remained disorganized and vulnerable on the beaches. But Hitler's insistence on personal control of armored reserves had paralyzed the German response. Von Luck's tanks sat immobilized throughout the morning, waiting for authorization from the Führer's headquarters. When permission finally came, Allied air superiority made movement nearly impossible. Thunderbolt fighter bombers attacked anything that moved on Norman roads, turning the advance into a running battle against overwhelming odds. The German 352nd Infantry Division, holding the Omaha sector, had fought with the professional competence that marked Wehrmacht units throughout the war. Their defensive positions were expertly sighted, their fields of fire calculated with Prussian precision. Individual soldiers displayed the tactical skill developed through years of combat experience on multiple fronts, but competence could not overcome material disparity on this scale. German artillery pieces, carefully rationed to 50 rounds per gun per day, fell silent as American naval bombardment continued hour after hour. Luftwaffe aircraft, once masters of European skies, were nowhere to be seen. The contrast between German restraint and American abundance was stark enough to break morale among even veteran troops. Major Pluskat, commanding the coastal artillery battery that had dominated Omaha Beach since dawn, radioed his final situation report at 1600 hours, position overrun, ammunition exhausted, request permission to withdraw. The response came back with characteristic German efficiency. Withdrawal authorized. Destroy all equipment. As German forces pulled back from their coastal positions, they left behind defensive works that had taken 3 years to construct. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's boasted barrier against invasion, had been breached in a single day. More importantly, the myth of German invincibility had been shattered by American industrial might, applied with devastating precision. The Wehrmacht's tradition of tactical excellence, forged in the campaigns of Poland, France, and Russia, proved inadequate against an enemy that could afford to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. German soldiers, among the finest infantry in military history, found themselves fighting not just American troops, but American factories, American shipyards, American farms, the productive capacity of an entire continental economy mobilized for war. On June 7th, 24 hours after the initial landings, Bradley's staff updated their operational maps with red arrows stretching across all 5 invasion beaches. The statistics told a story that would have seemed impossible the previous morning. 156,000 Allied troops ashore, with casualties lighter than the most optimistic projections, except at Omaha Beach. The D-Day landings had required 5 AS-333 ships and landing craft, supported by 196,000 naval personnel, a fleet larger than all combatant navies combined at the start of the war. The logistics of assembling such a force spoke to organizational capabilities that dwarfed any previous military operation in human history, American. Production figures for 1944 revealed the industrial foundation of victory. 88 Thor 10 tanks manufactured that year, compared to Germany's 17,800. 74,000 aircraft produced in American factories, against 25,000 for all Axis powers combined. 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, enough to sustain intensive combat operations for years without rationing. But the most telling comparison involved shipping tonnage. The United States launched 19 million tons of new shipping in 1944, replacing war losses and expanding cargo capacity simultaneously. Germany's entire merchant marine had been reduced to 700,000 tons, barely enough to maintain coastal traffic within occupied Europe. Eisenhower and Bradley studied these figures in the Augusta's chart room, understanding that D-Day represented something more than tactical victory. The invasion demonstrated democracy's capacity to organize, produce, and sustain military operations on a scale that totalitarian governments could not match despite their claims of efficiency and unity. The German response to invasion revealed the limitations of centralized command structure. Hitler's insistence on personal control had paralyzed local commanders throughout the critical first hours. Rommel's absence for his wife's birthday reflected the Reich's inability to delegate authority even to proven commanders. The contrast with Allied command flexibility was stark. On the beaches themselves, evidence of American abundance was visible in every direction. Supply dumps growing hourly as LSTs discharged their cargoes. Bulldozers carving supply roads through obstacle-strewn terrain. Jeeps carrying medical supplies to aid stations that had been battlefield positions that morning. The tide had turned, literally and figuratively. What began as the most dangerous gamble in military history had become a demonstration of democratic capitalism's capacity to translate industrial might into battlefield dominance. D-Day was no longer a desperate assault against prepared positions. It had become the inevitable result of superior production applied with overwhelming force. Within a week of the initial landings, the transformation of the Norman countryside exceeded anything in military history. American engineers constructed artificial harbors, the Mulberry Harbors, by towing massive concrete caissons across the English Channel and sinking them in precise formations off the invasion beaches. Each caisson weighed 6,000 tons, larger than most warships, yet they were manufactured in British factories and delivered on schedule. The Pluto pipeline under the ocean, pumped aviation gasoline directly from England to France through underwater cables. American petroleum engineers had solved the logistical nightmare of fuel supply by applying industrial solutions to military problems. German forces, meanwhile, converted vehicles to run on wood gas and charcoal due to petroleum shortages. By July 1944, over 1 million Allied troops had landed in Normandy, supported by 171,000 vehicles and 566,000 tons of supplies. The beachhead had become a massive military base, complete with airfields, hospitals, repair depots, and communication centers. Roads carved through ancient farmland carried traffic loads that exceeded peacetime capacity of major European highways. French civilians, emerging from 4 years of occupation rationing, encountered abundance that bordered on the miraculous. American field kitchens served hot meals to entire villages. Medical corpsmen treated civilian casualties with supplies that exceeded the inventory of most European hospitals. GIs distributed candy, cigarettes, and canned goods with the casual generosity of men representing a nation that had never known genuine scarcity. The contrast between liberation and occupation was visible in every detail. German troops had requisitioned food, fuel, and transportation, leaving French communities to survive on subsistence rations. American forces brought their own supplies and shared surplus with civilians. The difference reflected fundamental distinctions between predatory and productive economies. Allied air superiority was total. Over 11,000 sorties flown on D-Day alone, compared to fewer than 300 by the Luftwaffe. German aircraft production had shifted to fighters for homeland defense, leaving no resources for ground support operations. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs ranged across France unopposed, attacking anything that moved on roads and railways. The strategic implications were profound. Germany's military tradition, forged through centuries of European warfare, proved inadequate against an enemy that fought with the productive capacity of an entire continent. The Wehrmacht's tactical excellence could not overcome material disadvantages of such magnitude. Normandy had become the springboard for liberation, but more importantly, it demonstrated democracy's capacity to outproduce, outsupply, and outlast totalitarian militarism. 75 years later, veterans of the 29th Infantry Division gathered at the American Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach for the annual D-Day commemoration. White marble crosses stretched in precise rows across manicured grass, each marking a soldier who had paid freedom's price on Norman soil. The morning mist rising from the English Channel carried echoes of that June dawn when democracy's fate hung in the balance. Sergeant John Spaulding, now in his 90s, walked slowly among the graves, his grandson supporting his arm. Each cross bore a name, rank, and home state. Boys from Kansas and California, Texas, and Maine, who had traveled across an ocean to fight for peoples they had never met. The diversity of American units reflected the democratic ideal. Citizen soldiers representing every region, ethnicity, and background, united in common cause. The hidden truth of D-Day's victory was finally being acknowledged by military historians. Courage alone had not won the battle. American industrial capacity had provided the margin of victory. The ability to build Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The capacity to produce aircraft, tanks, and ammunition on a scale that overwhelmed German defenses through sheer material superiority. American GDP in 1944 had equaled that of all Axis powers. Combined, economic dominance that translated into battlefield supremacy, democratic capitalism mobilized for war, had proven more efficient than totalitarian economies despite claims of superior organization and unity. Free workers in American factories had outproduced slave labor in German industries by margins that defied belief. The lesson extended beyond military history into the fundamental nature of democratic societies. America's strength came not from martial tradition or warrior culture, but from the productive capacity of free citizens working toward common goals. The arsenal of democracy had demonstrated that abundance, properly organized, could defeat scarcity regardless of tactical skill or strategic planning. General Bradley's gamble with the destroyers had worked because it was backed by industrial might that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The naval guns that shattered the Atlantic Wall were products of American steel mills, operated by crews trained in American schools, supplied by a logistical system that spanned continents. As the ceremony concluded and veterans placed wreaths on the graves of their comrades, the message was clear. On these beaches, democracy's abundance had proven stronger than tyranny's scarcity. The arsenal of democracy had delivered its promise, and freedom had marched on from Normandy to final victory. The wind that swept across Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, carried more than smoke and salt. It carried the weight of decisions made under impossible pressure. General Omar Bradley's choice to hurl U.S. Navy destroyers into point-blank range of German defenses was not simply a battlefield maneuver. It became a symbol of how leadership backed by courage and industrial power can bend history's course. The men who clawed their way off that beach may not have known it at the time, but they were part of something far larger than a tactical victory. They had secured the foothold from which Europe would be freed. But what did this impossible gamble mean in the days, years, and decades that followed? By the morning of June 7th, the beaches of Normandy no longer resembled killing grounds. They had become arteries of liberation, pumping men and machines inland. Engineers paved the sand with steel matting, creating roadways for tanks and trucks. Graves registration units solemnly began their work among the fallen, marking plots that would later become the American Cemetery at Colville. The cost of victory was staggering, over 4,400 Allied dead in a single day, nearly half of them Americans at Omaha. For every foot of sand gained, lives were given. Yet the very fact that Omaha had not been evacuated, as Bradley's staff had begged, proved decisive. Instead of disaster, the Allies had achieved the unthinkable: 5 simultaneous lodgements along a fortified coast. From that moment, Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but of when. Bradley himself rarely spoke of the decision that saved Omaha. To him, it was not an act of brilliance, but one of necessity. The destruction of the German positions, he later wrote, was the only means left to us to salvage the operation. Yet historians and military scholars came to see his gamble as one of the most consequential battlefield choices of the Second World War. Unlike the charismatic Patton or the towering Eisenhower, Bradley earned the nickname the soldier's general. His calm demeanor and respect for the common infantryman distinguished him from peers who often chase glory. The destroyers he ordered forward did more than silence guns. They allowed the 29th and 1st Infantry Divisions to regroup, reorganize, and turn slaughter into momentum. On the other side of the wire, German officers tried to comprehend how their meticulously prepared defenses had failed. Bunkers that had withstood aerial bombing and long-range naval fire collapsed under direct 5-inch shelling. Positions carefully sited to create interlocking fields of fire fell silent, when naval gunners operating within sight of their targets picked them apart with methodical precision. The Wehrmacht was not defeated by cowardice or lack of skill. Indeed, many German defenders fought to the last round, inflicting heavy casualties even as their own positions crumbled. But they fought an enemy that brought more than courage to the battlefield. They fought against an economy that could replace destroyed ships and lost tanks in weeks, while Germany struggled to replace a single division in months. Bradley's gamble succeeded because America's arsenal stood behind it. For the French, liberation began not with speeches, but with the simple presence of young men carrying Hershey bars and Lucky Strikes. The Dubois family of Colville was not unique. Across Normandy, families emerged from cellars and barns to meet the soldiers who represented hope. Farmers who had surrendered livestock to German requisitioning found themselves given canned rations. Children tasted chocolate for the first time. Doctors with nothing but salt and herbs for medicine suddenly found themselves supplied with penicillin and sulfa drugs. This generosity was not merely charity, it was policy. American logistics planners had anticipated not only the needs of armies, but also of civilians trapped in war zones. The abundance of supplies allowed soldiers to share without diminishing their own survival. To the people of France, the difference between occupier and liberator was stark. The struggle in Normandy did not end with D-Day. For weeks, the Allies battled hedgerows, villages, and stubborn German resistance. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, finally shattered the German lines, opening the road to Paris. Every advance traced its origin to the survival of the Omaha bridgehead. When Paris was liberated in August, the world celebrated the spectacle of tanks rolling down the Champs-Élysées. Yet those parades rested on the shoulders of men who had clawed their way across 500 yards of sand under relentless machine gun fire. The gamble of destroyers had bought the time and space necessary for Allied momentum to grow unstoppable. Military historians often debate turning points: Stalingrad, Midway, El Alamein. But D-Day represents something distinct. It was not just a clash of armies, but a contest between economic systems. Nazi Germany had perfected tactical excellence, training soldiers who could maneuver with precision and flexibility. Yet tactical genius could not overcome factories that produced planes faster than they could be shot down, or shipyards that launched freighters faster than U-boats could sink them. Bradley's gamble worked because democracy had already won the war of production. Destroyers risked at Omaha could be replaced. German bunkers reduced to rubble could not. Decades later, as veterans aged and their numbers dwindled, the meaning of D-Day shifted from immediate strategy to lasting legacy. White marble crosses in Normandy and names inscribed on memorial walls became symbols of sacrifice. School children walked among them, learning that freedom had been purchased not in abstract debates, but in blood spilled on sand. Sergeant John Spaulding, who had crawled across the killing ground at Omaha, would live long enough to bring his grandson to those same graves. For him, the gamble that saved his life was not simply Bradley's decision, it was the faith of every man who kept moving forward when retreat seemed certain. By 1944, the United States' gross domestic product equaled that of all Axis powers combined. In Detroit, automobile plants had transformed into tank factories. In California, shipyards produced freighters in days instead of months. On farms across the Midwest, harvests fed not only America, but also its allies. The true miracle of D-Day was not that men had survived Omaha Beach, but that a free society had organized itself to project power across an ocean. The destroyers at Omaha were steel manifestations of that abundance. They were not isolated ships, but representatives of an entire economy. When their guns silenced the Atlantic Wall, they fired shells manufactured by free workers, delivered by supply chains stretching across continents, and guided by commanders empowered to make decisions without fear of dictators' wrath. Looking back, one might ask, was Bradley's decision reckless, even desperate? Naval officers at the time certainly thought so. To expose destroyers to coastal batteries was to invite disaster. But war is never fought with guarantees. Bradley understood that inaction meant certain defeat. Action, even reckless action, at least offered a chance at survival. History has judged him kindly, not because the risk was small, but because the consequences were immense. In that moment, on the deck of USS Augusta, Bradley embodied the truth of command, to act decisively when every instinct urges caution. 75 years after D-Day, the beaches of Normandy are quiet. Tourists walk the sand where machine guns once raked the surf. Children build castles where engineers once cleared mines. The sea that carried destroyers to within 1,000 yards of the cliffs now carries sailboats and ferries, yet the silence is deceptive. Beneath the calm lies a memory that shapes the modern world. The gamble that transformed defeat into victory at Omaha Beach did more than save an invasion. It set the foundation for the liberation of Europe, the collapse of Nazism, and the emergence of a democratic order that still defines the West. History often turns on moments that seem small in the present. A general's decision to order ships forward, a commander's willingness to risk everything, a squad's determination to crawl a few yards farther under fire. But such moments accumulate, and when backed by the weight of a free people's industry, they reshape the destiny of nations. Bradley's gamble reminds us that victory in war is never inevitable. It is purchased by courage, sustained by organization, and secured by the strength of societies that believe in something greater than survival. On June 6, 1944, democracy proved that abundance of spirit, of resources, of determination was stronger than tyranny's scarcity. And so the waves still break on Omaha's shore. They wash over sand where thousands fell, where ships defied doctrine, and where history turned on the steady hand of a general who chose to risk everything. In their rhythm lies a reminder. Freedom endures, not because it is inevitable, but because in moments of crisis, men and women choose to gamble everything to preserve it. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.